So let's talk about villains. Specifically, relatable villains. Villains with conviction who truly believe in what they're doing. You know, the ones that stick in your mind, not just because they're evil, but because you can almost see their side of things. They're wrong, but they're wrong in a way that makes you question just how secure you are in your own beliefs. Before we dive into this topic though, let me take a moment to address some very thoughtful feedback I received on a previous video, specifically the one where I discussed the role of inherently evil races in a fantasy setting. First, a few commenters decided that advocating for the existence of such races in a fictional world made me, personally, a racist. Let's unpack that brilliant deduction for a second. If you're looking at orcs, goblins, or demons and drawing a direct comparison to real-world human races, that says far more about you than it does about me or the point that I was making. Fantasy creatures aren't stand-ins for real people. They're narrative tools rooted in myth and storytelling traditions that predate modern concepts of race by centuries. If you're incapable of viewing them as anything but analogies for human groups, maybe it's time to examine your own biases instead of projecting them onto me. Then, on the other side of the peanut gallery, the ones who claimed I was too dense to understand nuanced villains because I argued in favor of an archetypal evil. Let me be clear, I love nuanced villains. In fact, I'd argue that villains with complex motivations are some of the most compelling characters. But here's where you miss the point. Archetypal evil, mythical evil, doesn't preclude nuance. It creates the contrast that makes nuanced villains shine. We've said it numerous times on this channel, but a setting where everything is morally gray is not more complex. The existence of a dark, irredeemable force, something truly evil, allows the characters and the world to wrestle with questions of resistance, sacrifice, and morality. It sets the stage for nuanced, personal conflicts to emerge. Pretending that every villain has to be relatable or that every antagonist needs a tragic backstory is just as creatively stifling as pretending all villains should be flat and one-dimensional. You need both to tell a truly rich story. So now that we've cleared that up, let's talk about villains with conviction and why making them relatable doesn't mean making them justified. At the heart of any good villain is a question. What would I do in their place? The most compelling villains aren't just obstacles to overcome. They're reflections of the moral dilemmas and desires that we wrestle with in our own lives. They challenge the characters in a story, but more importantly, they challenge the players. Villains with conviction work because they believe in something beyond their own power or survival. They have a worldview, a guiding philosophy that they pursue with unwavering certainty. This kind of villain isn't scary because of what they do, but because why they do it. A mindless, rampaging monster might be dangerous, but a villain with conviction makes you question whether they're entirely wrong. Consider that conviction is a deeply human quality. It's what drives people to create, to endure, and to fight. It's also what drives people to commit atrocities in the name of something greater than themselves. A villain with conviction forces us to confront the double-edged nature of belief, how the very thing that makes us noble can also make us monstrous. What separates a villain with conviction from a generic antagonist is the depth of their motivation. A villain who simply wants power is shallow. A villain who wants power to protect their people, impose order on chaos, or avenge a perceived wrong is layered. It's not the what that makes them interesting, it's the why. This is why villains with conviction are often far more compelling than morally ambiguous antiheroes. Ambiguity can be effective, but it is the clarity of belief that draws us in. Villains with conviction force us to engage with their perspectives, to grapple with the uncomfortable realization that their choices might have been our choices in a different context. Philosophically, this taps into the idea of moral relativism versus moral absolutism. A villain with conviction often believes in an absolute truth. They've decided what's right and what's wrong, and they're acting accordingly. But their truth is not universal. It's rooted in their experience, their trauma, or their ideology. This clash of truths is what makes them dangerous. It's also what makes them fascinating. Magneto, for instance, doesn't see himself as a villain. He sees himself as a savior, a protector of mutants against a world that hates and fears them. His conviction isn't evil, it's righteous in his own mind, and that's what makes him so effective. You don't have to agree with him to understand him. In fact, understanding him makes it harder to dismiss him entirely, which is what makes his presence so powerful. His conviction makes him relatable, not in the sense that we agree with him, but in the sense that we recognize the same capacity for belief and justification within ourselves. Relatable villains are often mistaken for justified villains, but the two concepts couldn't be more distinct. Relatability is about understanding why someone believes and acts the way they do. It's about constructing motivations that feel grounded, human, and in some ways familiar. Justification, on the other hand, is about assigning moral correctness to those actions. Relating to a villain's perspective doesn't mean endorsing it. This distinction is critical in a world with moral absolutes, where good and evil are more than philosophical constructs, they're tangible forces. In such a world, a villain can be relatable while remaining unequivocally evil because relatability isn't tied to moral relativism. In settings where good and evil are codified, such as in many fantasy tabletop games, it might seem counterintuitive to make evil relatable. After all, if good is good and evil is evil, why bother creating complexity around the bad guys? But this is where relatability serves a higher narrative purpose. A relatable villain doesn't challenge the existence of moral absolutes, they highlight them. By creating a villain whose motivations are understandable, you deepen the impact of their fall into evil. It's not the absence of morality that makes them terrifying, it's their perversion of it. They may see themselves as good or necessary, but their actions, judged against the absolute moral framework of the world, are unquestionably wrong. For example, imagine a necromancer who raises armies of undead to defend their homeland from invaders. They may have started with noble intentions, using their forbidden magic to protect their people. But as they grow more powerful, they become consumed by the belief that their ends justify any means. They begin to see the living as little more than resources, tools to fuel their ever-growing legions. In a world with moral absolutes, this necromancer is undeniably evil, but their relatability, how they started at least, and how they rationalize their actions, makes them more compelling. It invites characters and players to ask, at what point did they cross the line? And could I have made that same choice? This approach doesn't justify the necromancer's evil, it shines a spotlight on it. Their relatable motivations emphasize the corruption of their actions, creating a contrast that makes the moral absolutes of the world feel more real and resonant. One of the most common critiques of relatable or justified villains is the fear that they blur the lines between good and evil, promoting moral relativism. But this critique misunderstands the purpose of relatability. A relatable villain doesn't dismantle moral absolutes, they operate within them, providing tension and conflict by pressing against those boundaries. A villain's relatable motives doesn't make their actions morally acceptable, they show how someone can justify evil while still being wrong. This is the core of moral absolutism. Evil doesn't stop being evil just because you can understand it. A well-crafted villain challenges us to empathize with their reasoning even as we reject their choices. In a world with absolute morality, a villain with conviction is measured against an objective standard. Their commitment to evil is powerful because we can see the line that they have crossed. They might believe that they are right, but we know by the rules of the world that they are wrong. This friction between belief and truth is what makes them so compelling. However, in a world without moral absolutes, that contrast disappears. A villain's unwavering belief becomes just another opinion, another worldview. If morality is relative, then their conviction isn't a horrifying rejection of goodness, it's just one perspective among many. And if everything is justifiable in some context, then conviction loses its edge because there's no clear reason why their belief matters more than anyone else's. And this is why I made the video about inherently evil races in the first place, to speak to why moral absolutes are so important in fantasy tabletop games. It wasn't about reducing villains to caricatures or making evil less interesting. It was about the necessity of a moral framework to give evil its weight and ability to matter. Villains with conviction are some of the best, most compelling antagonists, but conviction alone is not what makes them work. What makes them terrifying and what gives them their presence is the fact that they stand against something. They challenge a moral order that actually exists. They are not just another opinion in a world full of opinions, they are a force of opposition, the embodiment of defiance, destruction, or corruption against something greater than themselves. The problem arises when you put villains with conviction into a world where morality is completely relative. Because if morality is just another perspective, then so is their evil, It ceases to be monstrous and becomes just another viewpoint. And if everything is relative, then nothing is evil in any meaningful way. A tyrant who slaughters nations is no different than a king enforcing their laws. Both are just enforcing their own beliefs. A murderer is just expressing their worldview. The line between right and wrong dissolves, and with it, the power of evil itself. And here's the thing, most fantasy settings already have moral absolutes built into them. They just aren't leaned into by most dungeon masters. The vast majority of tabletop games and their settings have gods of good and evil, cosmic forces that define morality as something more than just cultural perspective. If your setting has a god of murder, lies, and corruption, then evil is real. It's not just a point of view, it's tangible, it exists, and it acts upon the world. The same applies to good. If a god of justice, mercy, or truth exists, then those concepts aren't just ideas, they have a fundamental reality that shapes the moral framework of the world. And yet for some reason, many dungeon masters refuse to lean into this. Instead, they fall back on the idea that everyone is the hero of their own story, and that good and evil are just perspectives. But in a world where gods literally embody these forces, that's just willful ignorance. It's not that moral ambiguity can't exist in these settings, because it absolutely can. But ambiguity only exists if it exists within a larger framework of moral absolutes. If evil is real, then characters can struggle against it, justify it, or even succumb to it. When crafting relatable villains in a world with moral absolutes, the key is to focus on the humanity, or at least the semblance of it, beneath their actions. Even in a setting where good and evil are clearly defined, every villain believes themselves to be justified. They don't wake up in the morning thinking, I'm going to do something evil today. They act out of fear, anger, love, ambition, or desperation. This doesn't mean their actions are excusable. In fact, relatability often makes their fall into evil even more tragic. A villain who began as a well-meaning idealist but succumbed to hatred or pride reminds us just how easily good intentions can be corrupted. They force us to confront the fragility of our own moral convictions and the consequences of letting them slip. Finally, it's important to remember that evil serves a narrative purpose in a world with moral absolutes. It's not there to be justified, it's there to be opposed. Evil provides contrast, stakes, and meaning to the hero's actions. A relatable villain amplifies these qualities by giving evil a face and a voice that draws us in even as it repels us. This is why relatability doesn't weaken the concept of absolute morality. It strengthens it by making the choice between good and evil more visceral and more personal. It shows us the cost of choosing the wrong path, and it reminds us why moral absolutes exist in the first place. In the end, a relatable villain isn't an argument for moral relativism. They're an invitation to engage with the complexity of evil while reaffirming that no matter how compelling their motives, evil is still evil, and it must be confronted. So, how do you all feel about this? Do you lean into the moral absolutes of the setting you run? If not, how do you make your villains stand out amongst the moral relativists? Let me know in the comments. Either way, thank you for watching. I am Trill, and I hope you enjoyed.